Redstone Gulch was not built so much as it was scratched out of the hard, unforgiving earth of the Wyoming Territory. It sat in a bowl of red dust and dry scrub brush, a scar upon the landscape that bled copper dirt whenever the wind kicked up, which was always. The year was 1878, and the air tasted of iron, horse manure, and the desperate, metallic tang of impending progress. The railroad was coming. You could not see the tracks yet, nor hear the whistle of the steam engine, but the town could feel it. It vibrated in the ground like a coming stampede. Men with surveying equipment and clean suits had been seen on the horizon, marking the land like butchers deciding where to make the first cut. In Redstone Gulch, law was a fluid concept, usually dictated by the weight of lead in a cylinder or the weight of gold in a pocket. The buildings were timber skeletons, hasty constructions of pine that leaked sap in the summer heat and drafts in the winter chill. The main street was a wide avenue of dirt that turned to sucking mud when the rains came. Flanked on either side by the institutions of civilization, a general store, a livery stable, a bank with barred windows, and 3 saloons, the most respectable of which was Alma's place. Sheriff Eli Granger stood on the boardwalk outside his office, surveying his domain with the possessive air of a man who owned a dog he frequently kicked. Granger was a man who wore his authority like his oversized coat. It covered a multitude of sins, but did not quite fit. He was handsome in a greasy, slicked-back sort of way, with a mustache he waxed every morning and eyes that were always calculating the odds. He did not look like a man who cleared leather for the sake of justice. He looked like a man who cleared leather because someone had not paid their dues. The badge on his chest was polished to a mirror shine, reflecting the harsh western sun, but the soul underneath was tarnished. Granger had made his peace with the cattle barons to the north and the railroad agents from the east. He kept the peace just enough to keep commerce flowing, but he turned a blind eye when a drover beat a prostitute or a land speculator burned out a squatter. "Sheriff," a passerby nodded, tipping a stained hat. Granger barely acknowledged the greeting. His eyes were fixed on a point high above the town, on the jagged spine of the ridge that overlooked the valley. There, a single plume of smoke rose from a cabin perched precariously on the edge of the cliff face. "Still there," Granger muttered to himself, his hand drifting unconsciously to the handle of his Colt revolver. Stubborn heathen. The cabin belonged to the one man in Redstone Gulch who did not fear Eli Granger. In fact, he was the one man the town feared more than the sheriff. They called him the Fearest man in town, a title earned not through bluster or threats, but through a silence so heavy it could crush a man's lungs. His name was Coda Blackhawk. High on the ridge, the air was thinner, cleaner, and colder. Coda Blackhawk sat on the stump of a felled pine, sharpening a skinning knife with a rhythmic shh sound that mimicked the wind in the trees. He was a man carved from the very rock of the mountains. His heritage was a mixture of Lakota and Cheyenne, a bloodline of warriors and wanderers that the encroaching government was trying desperately to extinguish. He was not an old man, perhaps in his early 30s, but his eyes held the weariness of 100 winters. They were obsidian black, void of light but full of memory. He wore his hair long, though he had adopted the trousers and boots of the white man, paired with a buckskin shirt that still smelled of wood smoke and sage. Coda was a ghost haunting the living. He had been a scout once, leading his people, and then later, in a twist of fate that still tasted like bile in his throat, he had scouted for the army in a misguided attempt to broker peace. It had not worked. The peace had been a lie written on paper that burned as easily as the villages. He had seen his world shatter, his family scatter into the reservations or into the earth. He had survived, and that was his greatest sin. The guilt was a physical weight he carried, heavier than the Winchester rifle leaning against the cabin wall. He lived alone. The town below tolerated him because they had no choice. 2 years ago, 6 drunken miners had decided to run the Redskin off the hill. Coda had sent them back down tied to their mules, broken in body and spirit, without firing a single shot. Since then, the legend has grown. They said he could track a hawk in the sky, that he could catch a bullet in his teeth, that he ate the hearts of his enemies. Coda knew the stories. He did not care. He only wanted the silence. But the silence had been broken yesterday. He touched his side, wincing. A bruise, purple and ugly, was blooming across his ribs. Yesterday afternoon, 3 cowboys from the Circle T Ranch had come up the trail, full of whiskey and bad intentions. They had not wanted to kill him, just humiliate him. They had smashed his windows, kicked over his rain barrel, and tried to set fire to his woodpile. Coda had stopped them. It had been a brutal, ugly brawl in the mud. He had broken an arm and a jaw, but he had taken his share of blows. The cabin was a wreck. The inside was streaked with mud where they had wrestled. There was dried blood on the floorboards, some his, mostly theirs. A bottle of rot-gut whiskey had been smashed against the wall, leaving a sticky, reeking mess that drew flies. And then the storm came. It had howled down from the peaks during the night, a banshee of wind and freezing rain. The roof, already weakened by neglect, had given way in the corner. Water and grit had poured in for hours, turning the dirt and blood on the floor into a foul slurry. Coda stood up and walked to the doorway of his cabin. It was a small structure, built for survival, not comfort. He looked at the mess inside. The cot was soaked. The hearth was filled with wet ash, the stench of stale alcohol, old blood, and wet dog, though he had no dog, was overpowering. He could fix the roof. He could hunt the elk. He could fight 3 men at once. But looking at the domestic disaster that was his home, Coda felt a strange, paralyzing defeat. He did not know how to scrub the stain of violence out of wood. He did not have the patience to wring out sodden blankets until his hands cramped. He needed help. The admission was bitter, like chewing on willow bark. He needed a woman's hand, or at least someone who knew the domestic arts better than a retired warrior whose hands were shaped only for destruction. Down in the valley, on the ragged fringe of town where the respectable houses gave way to shanties and tents, Rhea Collins was hanging a sheet on a line strung between 2 scrub oaks. Rhea was a woman who seemed to be fading into the sepia tones of the landscape. She was perhaps 26 or 27, though the sun and the wind had etched fine lines around her eyes that made her look older. She was not beautiful in the way the saloon girls were, with their painted faces and bright feathers. Her beauty was like a wildflower growing in a drought, resilient, quiet, and easily overlooked. She had hair the color of dried tobacco leaves, usually hidden under a bonnet, and eyes of a startling, clear blue that seemed to hold the only moisture in the entire territory. "Hold the end. Jonah," she said, her voice raspy from the dry air. A boy of 12, skinny as a rail but with a jaw already set in stubbornness, grabbed the wet fabric. "It is tearing. Ma, the wind is too strong." "It will hold," Rhea said firmly. "It has to." Everything in Rhea's life had to hold. There was no margin for error. She was a washerwoman, taking in the filth of the miners and the clerks, scrubbing their sins away with harsh lye soap until her knuckles were red and cracked. The town of Redstone Gulch viewed Rhea Collins with a mixture of suspicion and pity. She was a woman alone, which was dangerous. She was poor, which was common, but she was proud, which was unforgivable. She took no charity. When the church ladies brought a basket of food last Christmas, Rhea had politely declined, saying they had plenty, even though the cupboard contained only a bag of beans and half a sack of flour. She had no man. This was the source of the greatest speculation. A woman looking like she did could have easily found a protector, a miner looking for a wife, or even a patron at the saloon. But Rhea walked with her head down, returning to her shanty before the sun touched the horizon. She kept to herself. "Is there any stew left?" a small voice asked. Rhea looked down. Ben, 7 years old, was tugging at her skirt. He had the same dark hair as Jonah, but his eyes were wide and dreamy, always looking at clouds instead of the mud. "A little baby," Rhea lied. There was none. "I will warm it up." She looked at the shanty behind them. It was barely a house. It was a patchwork of reclaimed lumber and canvas, sitting on a patch of land that belonged to the railroad company, or perhaps the bank. It was hard to keep track. But last week, a man in a suit came by. Mr. Henderson. The name made her stomach clench. He had told her the rent on the parcel was going up. $5 a month. It might as well have been $5,000. Ma! It was Lila, 10 years old, stepping out of the dark interior holding Rose, the 4-year-old, on her hip. Rose is coughing again. Ria's heart squeezed. Give her the honey water. Lila, I have to go into town. I have to deliver the shirts to Mr. Abernathy at the bank. Can I come? Jonah asked, stepping forward, trying to look like a man. No, Ria said, too quickly. You stay. Watch the little ones. Do not open the door for anyone. Not anyone. She wrapped her shawl tight around her shoulders. She had to get the money from the banker. It would be 50 cents. It was not enough for the rent, but it would buy milk for Rose and perhaps a soup bone. She walked toward the town, her boots kicking up little puffs of red dust. She felt the eyes of the men on the porches of the saloons as she passed, heavy and suffocating. She kept her gaze on the ground, navigating the ruts. She was invisible. She had to be. If they really saw her, if they saw what she was hiding in that shanty, the fragile world she had built would collapse. Coda Blackhawk descended the trail into town like a shadow lengthening at twilight. He rode his horse, a roan mare with a white star on her forehead, with the easy grace of a man born in the saddle. He did not ride down the main street. He stuck to the alleys, the spaces between buildings where the refuse piled up. He tied the mare behind Alma's place. The back door was open, letting out the smell of stale beer and tobacco smoke. He stepped inside. The saloon was dim, lit by kerosene lamps that cast long, wavering shadows. It was mid-afternoon, so the crowd was thin, a few hardcore drinkers nursing glasses of whiskey, a table of card players, and Alma herself wiping down the mahogany bar. When Coda entered, the room did not go silent, but the temperature seemed to drop 10 degrees. The piano player, a thin man with a bowler hat, missed a note, faltered, and then resumed playing softly, as if afraid to make a noise. Conversations hushed. Men looked into their glasses. No one met his eyes. This was the power of the dearest man in town. They saw the knife at his belt, the scars on his arms, and the darkness in his face, and they saw their own death reflected there. Coda walked to the bar. He moved with a silence that was unnerving for a man of his size. Alma, a stout woman with hair dyed a violent shade of red and a heart that had hardened decades ago, did not flinch. She was one of the few who spoke to him. Blackhawk, she nodded. Whiskey. Paper, Coda said. His voice was deep, like stones grinding together underwater. And charcoal. Alma raised an eyebrow, but reached under the bar. She produced a sheet of rough wrapping paper and a stick of charcoal used for marking tabs. Coda took them. He did not sit. He leaned against the bar, his back to the room, blocking out the stares that bored into his spine. He wrote slowly. The letters were blocky and sharp. He had learned to write English at the mission school before he had burned it down in his mind 1,000 times. He finished, turned, and slapped the paper onto the announcement board near the door, right next to a faded wanted poster for a cattle thief and an advertisement for a patent tonic. He reached into a pouch at his belt and pulled out a silver dollar. He placed it on the bar. For space, he said. You don't have to pay for tacking up a sign. Coda, Alma said, pushing the coin back. I pay, he said. I owe no one. He turned and walked out. The swing doors groaned on their hinges. The room exhaled. What did he write? A miner whispered, finally looking up. They crowded around the board. The charcoal letters were dark and angry against the brown paper. Cabin cleaning. Cash. No questions. See the man on the hill? Cleaning, one of the cowboys laughed nervously. The savage wants a maid. I wouldn't go up there for $100 in gold, another muttered. They say he keeps scalps on his mantle. I heard he speaks to spirits, an old prospector wheezed. Bad spirits. Sheriff Granger, who had just entered through the front door, pushed his way through the crowd. He looked at the sign, his lip curling in a sneer. He ripped it down, crumpled it, and then, after a moment of hesitation, smoothed it back out and pinned it back up. Leave it, Granger said, a cruel glint in his eyes. Let's see who is desperate enough to serve a dog. Then we will know who else in this town isn't worth the bullet to shoot them. Rhea Collins delivered the shirts. Banker Abernathy had complained about a button that was chipped, even though it had been chipped when he gave it to her. He paid her 40 cents instead of 50. Rhea had swallowed her pride, taken the coins, and walked out before she screamed. 40 cents. It would buy the milk. It would not buy the bone. She walked past Alma's place. She usually crossed the street to avoid the saloon, the smell of liquor reminding her too much of her father and her husband. But the wind had blown a piece of paper loose from the board near the door, and it tumbled across her path, sticking to the mud on her boot. Rhea bent down to peel it off. She meant to throw it away, but the bold, dark strokes of the charcoal caught her eye. Cabin cleaning. Her heart gave a painful thump against her ribs. Cleaning. That was what she did. That was all she knew how to do. Cash. No credit at the store. Not a barter for old clothes. Cash. Hard currency. The kind Mr. Henderson demanded for the land. No questions. Rhea froze. That was the phrase that hooked her. In a town where everyone wanted to know your business, where the sheriff asked why she bought boys' boots when she lived alone, where the grocer asked why she needed so much flour for one person. No questions was a luxury more valuable than gold. She looked at the final line. See the man on the hill. Her hand trembled, crinkling the paper. The man on the hill. Coda Blackhawk. She looked up toward the ridge. The sun was setting behind it, casting the cabin in a silhouette that looked like a jagged tooth biting into the sky. She had heard the stories. Everyone had. They said he was a killer. They said he hated white people. They said he was a heathen who worshipped blood. Just this morning, she had heard the women at the well whispering about the fight at his place. Blood everywhere, they had said, like a slaughterhouse. Fear, cold and sharp, pricked at her skin. To go up there, alone, to the house of a warrior. It was madness. No woman in Redstone Gulch would dare. It was social suicide, and perhaps physical suicide. She looked down at the 40 cents in her palm. Then she thought of the shanty. She thought of Jonah trying to be a man at 12. She thought of Ben's coughing, and Rose's little hands reaching for food that wasn't there. She thought of the sheriff's eyes, watching her, waiting for her to fail so he could move in. If she did not get $5 by the first of the month, they would be out on the street. And on the street, she could not hide them. On the street, the secrets would come out, and they would take the children away. Rhea smoothed the paper against her leg. She folded it carefully and put it in her pocket, right next to the 40 cents. She looked up at the hill again. The fear was still there, a knot in her stomach, but it was smaller than the fear of losing her family. No questions, she whispered to the wind. She pulled her shawl tighter, turned her back on the safe, respectable street, and began to walk toward the edge of town, where the trail wound up into the darkening rocks. She will go tomorrow. She would walk into the dragon's den, and she would scrub his floor, and she would take his money, because a mother would walk through the gates of hell for her children, and Coda Blackhawk's cabin was just one step closer than that. The morning sun beat down on Redstone Gulch like a blacksmith's hammer, flattening the shadows and baking the red dust into a hard crust. For Rhea Collins, the heat was the least of her worries. The landlord, Mr. Henderson, had stopped by the shanty at dawn, his knuckles rapping on the flimsy door frame like a woodpecker searching for rot. He did not shout. Men like Henderson never needed to shout. He simply reminded her, in a voice as dry as the parchment he carried, that the rent for the patch of dirt she occupied was due in 3 days. If the money was not in his hand, the land would return to the bank, and she would return to the road. He did not know about the 4 pairs of eyes watching him through the cracks in the wall. No one did. That was the only reason they were still together. Rhea stood at the foot of the trail leading up to the ridge. She had a canvas sack slung over her shoulder containing her brushes, a bar of harsh lye soap, and rags torn from an old petticoat. She had wrapped a faded calico scarf around her head to protect her hair from the dust. pulling it low to shadow her face. She looked up. Coda Blackhawk's cabin sat against the blue sky, silent and imposing. The town behind her was waking up, the sounds of hammers and horses drifting on the wind. But up there, it was just rock and hawk cries. She took a breath that tasted of sage and fear, tightened her grip on the sack, and began to climb. The walk was steep. By the time she reached the flat plateau where the cabin stood, sweat was trickling down her spine. The structure was rough-hewn timber, sturdy but battered. The storm had torn shingles off the roof, leaving it looking like a prize fighter with a missing tooth. Mud was splattered high on the walls. Rhea hesitated at the door. She raised her hand to knock, but before her knuckles could graze the wood, the door swung inward. Coda Blackhawk filled the frame. Rhea's breath hitched in her throat. The stories in town made him out to be a monster, a giant who ate raw meat and hated the sight of white skin. Standing there, he was certainly terrifying, but not in the way the drunks at the saloon described. He was terrifying because he was so intensely alive. He was bare-chested. His skin was the color of burnished copper, slick with sweat and crossed with the pale, jagged lines of old scars. On his left shoulder, a tattoo of a hawk in flight was inked in dark indigo, moving with the muscle as he breathed. But it was the fresh marks that drew her eye, a long, angry scratch across his ribs, and dried blood caked on his knuckles. His eyes were black, abyssal pools that took in everything: her worn boots, the trembling of her hands, the determination in her set jaw, and gave nothing back. "I saw the paper," Rhea said. Her voice came out stronger than she felt. "At Alma's. It said cash." Coda looked at her for a long moment. The silence stretched, tight as a bowstring. He did not ask who she was. He did not ask why a woman like her would walk up a mountain to clean a savage's den. $5, he said. His voice was deep, vibrating in the timber of the doorway. $5. It was exactly what Henderson wanted. It was salvation. "I will do it," Rhea said. "But I want the money when I finish. Not tomorrow. Today." Coda stepped back, opening the space for her to enter. "When you finish," Rhea stepped inside. The smell hit her first, a heavy, masculine scent of wood smoke, cured leather, and the metallic tang of old blood. The cabin was a disaster. The storm had driven mud and water through the broken roof, creating a slurry on the floor. A table lay overturned. A chair was smashed to kindling. It looked less like a house and more like the scene of a crime. She did not flinch. She had seen worse. She dropped her sack and took off her heavy outer coat, revealing a simple cotton shirt that had been washed so many times it was thin enough to be translucent in the shaft of sunlight cutting through the gloom. As she reached up to untie her scarf, the fabric of her shirt pulled tight across her back, outlining the curve of her spine. Coda was standing by the hearth, watching her. He was not leering like the men in town. His gaze was clinical, detached, like a wolf watching a deer to see if it was sick or strong. But when she turned, her collarbones exposed by the slightly open neck of her shirt, she caught a flicker in his dark eyes. He looked away sharply, focusing on the fire he was trying to rekindle. "Water is in the barrel outside," he muttered. "Wood is behind the house." Rhea nodded and set to work. She started with the floor, getting on her hands and knees to scrub at the mud. It was grueling labor. The lye soap stung her cracked fingers, but she scrubbed until the wood grain emerged from the filth. Coda moved around her, fixing the broken chair with a hammer and nails. He moved with a silent, predatory grace that made the small room feel crowded. Every time she passed him to wring out her rag, the air between them seemed to charge with static. She could smell him rain and pine and the salt of his skin. It was a raw, earthy smell that made her heart beat a strange, erratic rhythm against her ribs. She stood up to stretch her aching back and saw him wincing as he tried to lift a heavy beam to shore up the roof, the fresh cut on his back, which she had not seen clearly before, opened slightly, weeping fresh blood. "Stop," Rhea said. Coda froze, turning to look at her with a scowl. "I work. You are bleeding on the floor I just scrubbed. Rhea said, her tone practical. Sit down. He looked at her as if she had spoken in tongues. No one ordered the Fearest man in town to sit, but Rhea did not back down. She pointed to the stool by the fire. Slowly, warily. Coda sat. Rhea fetched a basin of clean, warm water and a soft cloth. She stepped behind him. Up close. The heat radiating from his body was intense. She hesitated for a fraction of a second, her hand hovering over his skin. This was intimate. To touch a man, especially this man, was to cross a line drawn by the entire town. She touched the damp cloth to his shoulder. Coda's muscles bunched tight, hard as iron under her fingertips. Relax, she whispered. I am not going to hurt you. She cleaned the wound with gentle, efficient strokes. She could feel the power in his back, the dormant violence of a warrior. Yet he sat perfectly still for her. Her breath caught in her throat as she leaned in to check a deeper cut near his spine. A lock of her hair escaped her scarf and brushed against his neck. Coda inhaled sharply. The sound was loud in the quiet cabin. Rhea pulled back as if burned, her face flushing hot. For a second, neither moved. The air was thick, heavy with unsaid things, with the sudden, shocking awareness of a man and a woman alone in a high place. It is clean, she said, her voice breathless. Keep it dry. Coda stood up abruptly, moving away from her touch. He did not say thank you. He went to the window and stared out, his hands gripping the sill until his knuckles turned white. Rhea turned back to her scrubbing, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. Outside. The sound of hooves crunched on the gravel. Coda's head snapped up. Rhea paused, her hands deep in the bucket. Sheriff Eli Granger rode his black gelding slowly past the open door of the cabin. He did not stop, but he slowed enough to look inside. He saw Coda standing by the window, shirtless and dark, and he saw Rhea on her knees, her hair loose around her face, looking up with wide, startled eyes. Granger's face twisted into a mask of disgust and dark amusement. He tipped his hat, a mocking gesture, and rode on. He saw me, Rhea whispered. He saw me here. He sees nothing, Coda growled, though his eyes were narrowed as he watched the lawman descend the trail. He sees only what he hates. Rhea worked through the afternoon with a frantic energy. The encounter with the sheriff had terrified her, reminding her of the precipice she lived on. By the time the sun began to dip below the peaks, painting the sky in bruises of purple and orange, the cabin was transformed. The floor was clean, the furniture mended, the air smelling of soap and sage instead of rot. She put on her coat, buttoning it all the way to her chin. I am done. Coda looked around the room. It was orderly. It felt different. It felt less like a cage. He reached into a leather pouch on his belt and pulled out $5 silver. He held them out. Rhea took them, her fingers brushing his calloused palm. The contact sent a shiver up her arm. She quickly shoved the coins deep into her pocket, her hand staying there to guard them. Where do you go? Coda asked. It was the first question he had asked her all day. Rhea stiffened. I told you, the edge of town. It is late, Coda said. The trail is dark. Coyotes are out. I am not afraid of coyotes. Rhea said, I can take care of myself. She turned and walked out the door, not looking back. She could not let him see the relief on her face, or the desperation. She had the money. They were safe for another month. Coda stood in the doorway, watching her retreating figure. She walked fast, too fast. She walked with her head down, her hand clutching her pocket. She did not walk like a woman going to a boarding house or a room above a shop. She walked like a prey animal trying to make it back to the burrow before the hawk struck. Something in his gut twisted. It was the instinct that had kept him alive through 3 Indian wars. Something was wrong. He waited until she disappeared around the bend of the trail. Then, he grabbed his shirt, pulled it on over his head, and picked up his Winchester. He did not lock the door. He owned nothing worth stealing that a man would risk his life for. He moved into the trees. He did not walk on the path. He moved through the brush, silent as smoke, his moccasins making no sound on the pine needles. He was the Fearest man in town, and he was hunting. He tracked her easily. She stayed on the main trail until she reached the bottom of the ridge. But then, instead of turning toward the lights of Redstone Gulch, she veered left. Coda frowned. There was nothing to the left but scrubland and the old creek bed that ran dry 10 months out of the year. It was the land nobody wanted, rocky and barren. He kept his distance, a shadow among shadows. He watched her stop and look behind her. Scanning the road, he froze against the trunk of a cedar tree, becoming part of the wood. She saw nothing. Satisfied, she hurried on. The path narrowed, winding through a thicket of cottonwoods. Finally, she stopped. Coda crept closer, crouching behind a boulder. In a small clearing, nestled against the side of a cut bank, was a structure that barely qualified as a shelter. It was a hodgepodge of driftwood, rusted tin sheets, and canvas, held together by mud and hope. It looked like a strong wind would blow it into the next territory. Rhea ran to the door. It was not a door. Really, just a heavy blanket hung over a frame. She pulled it aside. "Ma!" The cry was shrill and joyful. Coda watched, his breath catching in his chest, as 4 small figures erupted from the darkness of the hovel. There was a boy, perhaps 12, with hair as wild as a bird's nest, a girl, slightly younger, holding a toddler on her hip, and a small boy who clung to Rhea's leg like a burr. They were ragged. Their faces were smudged with dirt. Their clothes were patchwork quilts of oversized shirts and cut-down trousers. But their eyes were bright with a fierce, adoring light as they looked at the woman. Rhea dropped to her knees in the dust, embracing them all at once. The rigidity he had seen in her all day, the hard shell of the survivor, shattered. She buried her face in the toddler's neck, laughing a sound that was half sob. "Did you get it?" the oldest boy asked, his voice serious beyond his years. "Did you get the money, Ma?" Rhea pulled back, reaching into her pocket. She held up the 5 silver dollars. They caught the last light of the sun, shining like miracles. "I got it. Jonah," she whispered. "We are safe, mister. Henderson cannot take the land." "I was scared," the middle boy said. "Mister." Granger rode by. He looked at the house. Rhea's face hardened. She pulled the boy close. "He cannot hurt you. Ben, nobody can hurt you. I promise." Coda Blackhawk lowered his rifle. He stood in the darkness, the wind cooling the sweat on his skin. He had thought she was a woman with a secret lover, or perhaps a thief running from the law. He had expected many things. He had not expected this. He looked at the pitiful shack, at the woman who had scrubbed his floor until her hands bled, and at the 4 children clinging to her as if she were the only anchor in a spinning world. The Fearest man in town felt a crack form in the ice that had encased his heart for years. He had been paid to kill, and he had paid to be left alone. But looking at them, he realized he was looking at a courage greater than any he had ever shown on a battlefield. He turned silently, fading back into the night. He would not disturb them. Not tonight. But as he walked back up the hill to his empty, clean cabin, the silence he had always cherished felt suddenly unbearably loud. Sleep did not come to the cabin on the ridge that night. Coda Blackhawk lay on his cot, staring up at the newly repaired roof where the pine logs met the shadows. The silence of the mountain, usually his oldest and most trusted companion, now felt heavy, accusing. For 10 years, Coda had built a fortress of solitude. He had drawn a line in the red dust the town down there, and him up here. He dealt with the white men when he had to, traded furs for powder and lead, and otherwise let the ghosts of his ancestors be his only company. He had convinced himself that he wanted nothing else. He told himself that a warrior who had seen the things he had seen, the burning villages, the broken treaties, the frozen bodies in the snow, had no business seeking warmth. But the image of that shack burned behind his eyelids. He saw the boy with the defiant jaw, the girl holding the baby, the toddler clinging to Rhea's skirt. He saw the emptiness of their cupboard. He saw the way Rhea Collins had looked at 5 silver dollars as if they were the keys to the kingdom of heaven. He turned over, the buffalo hiding beneath him rustling. He was a Lakota. He knew that to invite the affairs of others into his life was to invite sorrow. But he also knew the warrior's code: you do not leave the weak to the wolves. when the sun crested the peaks, painting the sky in violent strokes of violet and blood orange. Coda rose. He did not sharpen his knife. He did not check his traps. Instead, he saddled his roan mare and rode down into the belly of the beast. Redstone Gulch was waking up. The air smelled of coffee and coal smoke. Coda tied his horse in front of the mercantile, ignoring the way the shopkeeper, a balding man named Silas, stiffened behind the counter. "Flour," Coda said, his voice rough from disuse. "A sack, the large one." Silas blinked. "Big sack that is 50 pounds. Blackhawk, you usually buy 10. And beans," Coda continued, ignoring the commentary. "Dried beef, rice." He paused, his eyes scanning the shelves filled with glass jars. "And the yellow ointment for cracked skin." Silas placed the tin on the counter. "The horse got a saddle sore." Coda did not answer. He placed 2 gold coins on the wood. "And the candy, the red sticks." Silas's mouth fell open slightly. "The peppermint for you." Coda's stare was a physical weight. Silas snapped his mouth shut, bagged the goods, and took the money. As Coda hauled the supplies out to his horse, he felt eyes on him. Across the street, Dr. Calder was leaning against the post of his office, lighting a pipe. The doctor was a man of science who drank too much brandy to forget what he couldn't cure, but his eyes were sharp. Next to him stood Alma, the saloon owner, her arms crossed over her ample chest. "That is a lot of provender for one man," Alma murmured, watching Coda secure the flour to his saddle. "And I have never known a Sioux warrior to have a sweet tooth for peppermint." "Perhaps he is stocking up for winter," Dr. Calder suggested, though he did not sound convinced. "It is August. Doctor," Alma said dryly, "something is changing up on that hill, and I wager it has something to do with the woman who walks up there every morning." Rhea returned the next day, and the day after that. The $5 had paid the rent, but it had not bought security. It had only bought time. She needed to keep the job. She worked with a ferocity that unsettled Coda. She scrubbed the walls, she beat the rugs, she polished the few pieces of silverware he owned until they gleamed. She moved around him like a ghost, trying to take up as little space as possible, but the cabin was small. "Your hands," Coda said on the 3rd day. He was sitting by the fire, oiling his Winchester. Rhea froze, her hand deep in a bucket of water. "What about them?" "They bleed." Rhea pulled her hand out and dried it quickly on her apron. The knuckles were raw. The skin split from the lye in the dry air. "It is work. It is fine." Coda stood up. He walked to the shelf where he had placed the yellow tin. He picked it up and set it on the table next to her. "Use it," he said. Rhea looked at the tin. It was an expensive medicinal sale. "I cannot take your medicine, Mr. Blackhawk. That is for your horse, surely." "My horse has tough skin," Coda said. "You do not." He turned his back to her, ending the argument. Rhea stared at the tin. Slowly, she opened it. The smell of arnica and beeswax drifted up. She rubbed a little on her knuckles, the relief instantaneous and sharp. She looked at his broad back, her throat tightening. "Thank you," she whispered. He grunted, not turning around. The game of leftovers began the following week. Coda was a hunter. He brought in deer, elk, and rabbit. He cooked simply, roasting the meat over the fire. "I cooked too much," he said one evening, pointing to a perfectly roasted haunch of venison wrapped in brown paper on the table. "The heat will spoil it by morning. Take it, or I throw it to the coyotes." Rhea looked at the meat. It was enough to feed Jonah and the little ones for 3 days. Her pride reared up, stiff and angry. She was not a beggar. She was Rhea Collins, and she took care of her own. "I do not need your charity," she said, her chin high. "It is not charity," Coda said, his voice flat. "It is a waste. I hate waste. It offends the spirits." He looked at her, his black eyes challenging her. He was giving her an out, a way to accept the gift without bending her knee. Rhea hesitated. She thought of Ben's thin face. She thought of the watery soup they had eaten for 2 nights. She snatched the package from the table. "Fine," she said curtly. "If you are just going to throw it away." But as she stuffed it into her bag, the fabric of her pocket bulged, and Coda saw the tension leave her shoulders. The weather in the territory was as treacherous as a rattlesnake. One afternoon, the sky turned a sickly, bruised purple. The wind died suddenly, leaving a vacuum of silence that made the ears ring. "Storm," Coda said, standing up from his chair. Rhea looked out the window. A wall of dust, a mile high and moving fast, was swallowing the valley. "I have to go," she said, grabbing her shawl. "The children—" "You will not make it," Coda said. He crossed the room in 2 strides and slammed the heavy bolt on the door home. "It is already here." The wind hit the cabin like a physical blow. The timbers groaned, and the world outside disappeared into a screaming brown void. Sand hissed against the glass and poured through the cracks in the walls. The temperature plummeted. The fire in the hearth sputtered as a downdraft shot down the chimney. Rhea shivered, wrapping her thin arms around herself. The cold in the high country was a living thing, seeking out bone and marrow. Coda watched her. Her lips were turning blue. Without a word, he reached for the buffalo robe on his bed, a massive, heavy hide that smelled of earth and animal. "Come," he said. "Sit by the fire." Rhea hesitated, then moved to the hearth. Coda sat down on the rug, and she sat beside him. He threw the robe over both of their shoulders, creating a cocoon against the howling world. Suddenly, the cabin felt very small. Rhea could feel the heat radiating from his side. His arm was pressed against hers. Under the heavy fur, the scent of him was overwhelming wood smoke, sage, and the clean, sharp smell of rain on stone. It was a masculine smell, ancient and comforting. She looked up at him. The firelight danced on his face, highlighting the sharp angles of his cheekbones and the depth of his eyes. He was looking at her, and for the first time, the mask of the warrior was gone. There was a hunger there, but not for food. It was the hunger of a man who has been cold for a very long time. Rhea felt her own breath hitch. Her heart was hammering against her ribs. Loud enough, she feared, for him to hear. The wind howled outside, tearing at the world. But in here, under the buffalo skin, there was a stillness that vibrated. Coda shifted. His hand moved, brushing against her waist. His fingers were rough, calloused, but his touch was tentative, almost questioning. Rhea found herself leaning in. Gravity seemed to have shifted, pulling her toward him. She saw his gaze drop to her lips. The distance between them is close to inches. She could feel his breath on her cheek, warm and steady. Every instinct in her body screamed to close the gap, to taste the danger, to find comfort in the arms of the one man strong enough to hold up the sky. Their lips were a breath away. Then, the image of Sheriff Granger's sneer flashed in her mind. The town, the whispers, the danger. If she crossed this line, there was no going back. Rhea pulled back sharply, gasping as if surfacing from deep water. "No," she whispered, her voice trembling. I cannot." Coda did not move. He did not try to grab her. He simply watched her, his eyes darkening again. "I have no room for trouble. Coda," she said, pulling the robe tighter around herself, creating a wall between them. "My life it is too full of trouble already." Coda looked at the fire. "Trouble finds us," he said quietly, "whether we make room for it or not." Down in Redstone Gulch, the storm had driven everyone into the saloons. Sheriff Eli Granger stood at the bar of the Nugget, swirling a glass of amber whiskey. He was watching the dust batter the window pane. "That Collins woman," Granger said to his deputy. "A dim-witted man named Pike who was whittling a stick. She is up there again, with the Indian." Pike looked up. "In this storm, she is trapped." Granger smiled, but it did not reach his eyes. "Trapped, that is one word for it. Cozy is another." He turned to the room, raising his voice just enough to be heard over the wind. "It is a shame," he announced to no one in particular. "A white woman, lowering herself like that. Desperate times, I suppose." But one has to wonder what kind of payment a savage extracts for his coin. A few men chuckled darkly. Others looked uncomfortable. But the seed was planted. It took root in the fertile soil of boredom and prejudice. Rhea Collins was no longer just the poor washerwoman. She was the woman who went up the hill. She was tainted. 2 days after the storm, Rhea left the cabin early. The tension between them had been a taut wire since the moment under the buffalo robe. They spoke only of work. The floor is dirty. The wood is low. Here is your money. She walked down the trail, clutching her shawl. She felt a prickling on the back of her neck. She stopped and turned. The trail was empty. She walked faster. She took the turn toward the scrubland, her boots crunching on the dry earth. She reached the clearing where the hovel stood, her heart racing. She stopped, standing 20 feet away, leaning against a dead cottonwood tree. Was Coda Black Hawk? Rhea gasped, dropping her bag. You followed me. I did, Coda said. He pushed himself off the tree. He was not hiding this time. He was wearing his buckskin shirt, his knife at his belt, and a single eagle feather tied in his hair. He looked like he was dressed for war, or ceremony. Why? Rhea demanded, stepping back, placing herself between him and the blanket door of the shack. To see where the trash lives, to see the woman who almost... She cut herself off, flushing. To see who eats the venison, Coda said calmly. He stepped forward. Rhea moved to block him, her hands coming up like claws. Go away, Coda, please. If they see you here, they have seen me everywhere, Coda said. I am the darkness in their corner. They do not look closely. He walked past her. He did not push her. He simply moved with a momentum that she could not stop. He reached the blanket door and pulled it aside. Rhea cried out, No! Coda stepped into the gloom of the shack. It took a moment for his eyes to adjust. The smell hit him: damp earth, unwashed bodies, sickness, and the faint, sweet scent of milk. 4 pairs of eyes stared back at him from the shadows. Get back! A voice cracked. Jonah, the 12-year-old, stood in the center of the dirt floor. In his hands, shaking violently, was an old Navy Colt revolver. It was rusted, the cylinder likely jammed, a relic of the war that had probably not fired in 10 years, but the boy held it with both hands, pointing it at Coda's chest. Jonah, no! Rhea screamed, rushing in behind Coda. Coda did not flinch. He looked at the gun, then up at the boy's eyes. He saw the terror there, but behind the terror, he saw the steel of a warrior. The hammer is not cocked, little warrior, Coda said softly. He moved so fast it was a blur. One hand swept out, not to strike, but to grasp the barrel of the gun. He twisted his wrist gently. The gun was pulled from Jonah's grip before the boy could blink. Jonah gasped, falling back. Coda held the rusted weapon in his palm. He looked at it with disdain, then placed it gently on a crate. This will blow your hand off before it hurts me. Never trust a weapon you have not cleaned. Rhea rushed to Jonah, pulling him against her side. Don't hurt him. He is just a boy. Coda looked around the room. Lila, the 10-year-old, was sitting on a pile of rags, holding the baby. Rose. Lila's eyes were wide and blue, calculating, watching him not with fear, but with an intense curiosity. She was the smart one. He could see it. She was assessing the threat. Ben, the 7-year-old, had scrambled under the only table, peering out from the darkness. And then there was Rose, the 4-year-old. She wiggled out of Lila's grip. She stood up on wobbly legs and walked toward the giant stranger. Rose, come back, Rhea hissed, but the little girl walked right up to Coda. She reached out a dirty little hand. She was not reaching for his knife. She was reaching for the black tip of the eagle feather that hung near his shoulder. Coda went still. He had faced cavalry charges. He had fought grizzly bears. But looking at this tiny creature, so fragile that a strong wind could break her, he felt paralyzed. She touched the feather. Bird, she said. Coda slowly lowered himself to one knee. He was now at eye level with her. Hawk, he corrected gently. He looked up at Rhea. The woman was trembling, clutching Jonah, tears streaming down her dust-streaked face. They are not all yours, Coda said. It was not a question. Rhea slumped, the fight draining out of her. "Jonah and Lila are mine," she choked out. "Ben and Rose, they belong to my sister. She died of fever on the wagon trail 3 years ago. Her husband took off west and never came back." She looked at Coda, her eyes pleading. "The town does not know. If Granger finds out, if the church finds out, they will split them up. They will send them to the orphanage in Cheyenne. They sell children there. Coda, I cannot let them take them. I promised her." Coda looked at the shack. He saw the gaps in the roof where the stars would shine through. He saw the empty iron pot on the cold stove. He saw the blanket Jonah slept on, which was nothing more than a burlap sack. He looked at the gun he had set down. It was useless. Just like Rhea's pride was useless against the winter that was coming. Just like his solitude was useless against the truth that was now standing in front of him. He stood up. The cabin seemed to shrink around his shoulders. "This roof will not hold snow," Coda said. Rhea wiped her eyes, confused. "What?" "The roof," Coda repeated. He walked to the wall and pressed his hand against a rotting beam. "And the north wall is weak." He turned to face her. The distance between them, the distance of race, of history, of fear, seemed to have evaporated in the stale air of the hovel. "You cannot stay here," he said. "We have nowhere else," Rhea snapped, her voice rising in desperation. "We have $5 and a sack of beans. This is it. Coda!" Coda looked at Jonah. "You want to protect your mother, boy?" Jonah nodded, his chin trembling. "Yes, then you need a better gun," Coda said, "and you need to learn how to use it." He looked back at Rhea. The conflict inside him was raging, the voice of his ancestors warning him that to love a white family was suicide. But then Rose giggled, still reaching for his feather, and the voice was silenced. "I'm going now," Coda said. "But I will be back." "Why?" Rhea whispered. "Why are you doing this?" Coda paused at the blanket door. He looked back at the 4 children and the woman who stood like a shield before them. "Because," Coda said, his voice low and final, "a warrior does not leave the battlefield until the fight is done. And your fight, Rhea Collins, is just beginning." He slipped out into the night, leaving behind a silence that was no longer empty, but filled with the terrifying, wonderful weight of hope. Sheriff Eli Granger sat behind his desk, the oak surface scarred by cigarette burns and knife points, holding a letter that smelled of expensive stationery and Eastern money. The letterhead bore the embossed seal of the Union Pacific Railroad. The words were typed, precise, and to Granger, they looked less like ink and more like gold dust. The surveyors had finalized the route for the spur line connecting the mines to the main artery. The tracks were not going through the center of town as the mayor had hoped, nor through the rich grazing lands of the Circle T Ranch. They were cutting a straight line through the scrubland on the southern ridge, the very same worthless patch of rock and dust where Rhea Collins had erected her pitiful shanty. "Eminent domain," Granger murmured, rolling the phrase around his mouth like a piece of hard candy. The railroad was authorized to pay $50 an acre for the land. Rhea Collins did not own the deed. Her dead husband had possessed a claim, but the paperwork was murky, lost in the chaotic archives of the county seat. If Granger could scare her off, or better yet, invalidate her claim entirely, he could snatch that land for pennies and sell it to the railroad for a fortune. He folded the letter and slid it into his breast pocket, right behind his tin star. He stood up, adjusting his gun belt. It was time to pay the widow Collins a visit, not as a sheriff, but as a concerned citizen. A very concerned citizen who knew that a woman alone was vulnerable, and that vulnerability was a commodity to be exploited. Rhea was walking down Main Street, a basket of laundry balanced on her hip. The midday sun was relentless, bleaching the color out of the wooden boardwalks. She kept her head down, avoiding eye contact with the men loitering outside the barber shop. Since Coda had found out about the children, a strange, fragile peace had settled over her. He had not returned to the shack, but she felt his presence. She found a sack of potatoes on her doorstep one morning. Another day, a stack of cured firewood. He was watching, It made the town feel less like a prison and more like a battlefield where she finally had an ally. "Mrs. Collins." The voice was smooth, like oil on water. Rhea stiffened. She stopped and turned to see Sheriff Granger stepping out of the shadows of the livery stable. He was smiling, but his eyes were flat and cold. "Sheriff," Rhea said, clutching the basket tighter. "I'm in a hurry." "We are all in a hurry in this new world," Granger said, stepping into her path. "But a lady should always have time for the law." He moved closer, invading her personal space. He smelled of bay rum and stale tobacco. "I have been thinking about your situation, Rhea," he said, using her first name with a familiarity that made her skin crawl. "It is not right, a woman of your appearance. Living out there in the filth, scrubbing shirts until your hands are raw." "It is honest work," Rhea said. "It is slave work," Granger corrected softly. "I have a proposition. The saloon needs a hostess, not a girl for the rooms upstairs," he added quickly, seeing her recoil, though the lie was evident in his smirk. "Just someone to pour drinks, smile at the investors. Or perhaps you could work for me, organizing my files, keeping my quarters tidy. I pay very well, and I offer protection." Rhea looked at him, understanding perfectly what keeping his quarters tidy meant. "I would rather scrub floors until my bones dissolve than take a penny from you. Eli Granger." Granger's smile vanished. His hands shot out, gripping her upper arm. His fingers dug into her flesh through the thin cotton of her sleeve. "Careful, Rhea," he hissed. "Pride is a luxury for the rich. You are sitting on a pile of debt. Your husband. Rest his useless soul. Left behind more than just you. He owed money to the general store, to the bank. I could have the court seize your assets tomorrow. That shanty, it could be kindling by sunset." "Let me go," Rhea said, struggling. "I am trying to help you," Granger said, shaking her slightly. "You are drowning, and I am the only boat in the water." Suddenly, the air around them seemed to freeze. The chatter of the street died down. Granger frowned, sensing the shift in the atmosphere. He looked up, standing 10 feet away. In the middle of the dusty street was Coda Blackhawk. He stood perfectly still, his arms hanging loose at his sides, his Winchester in the crook of his arm. He did not aim the rifle. He did not speak. He simply looked at Granger's hand on Rhea's arm with a gaze so intense, so devoid of humanity, that it felt like a physical blow. It was the look of a wolf deciding exactly where to tear the throat out of a stag. Granger's throat went dry. He was the law, but in the face of that silent, primal violence, his badge felt like a toy. He released Rhea's arm, smoothing his jacket. "Just having a friendly conversation," Granger said, his voice pitching slightly higher than usual. "Explaining the realities of the world to Mrs. Collins." Coda did not blink. He took one step forward. Granger backed up, nearly tripping over his own spurs. "Good day, Mrs. Collins." He turned and walked away, his stride stiff, trying to salvage his dignity while retreating from a fight he knew he would lose. Rhea let out a breath she didn't know she was holding. She looked at Coda. He did not smile. He gave a barely perceptible nod, then turned and vanished into the alleyway. That night, the wind picked up again, rattling the shutters of Coda's cabin on the ridge. Inside, the fire was roaring, casting long, dancing shadows against the log walls. Rhea was there, ostensibly to finish mending a tear in Coda's winter coat, but the needle lay idle in her lap. She was sitting in the chair by the hearth, her hands trembling. The encounter with Granger had shaken her to her core. It was not just the physical threat. It was the mention of the debt. She knew nothing of her husband's finances. He had been a secretive man, a dreamer who gambled on mining claims that never panned out. Coda poured amber liquid into 2 tin cups. He handed one to her. "Whiskey," he said. "Drink. It stops the shaking." Rhea took the cup. She did not argue. She took a long swallow, the liquor burning a trail down her throat and settling warm in her stomach. She coughed, wiping her mouth with the back of her hand. "He wants something," Rhea whispered, staring into the flames. "Granger, he does not just want me. He wants the land. I saw it in his eyes." Coda sat on the floor near her feet, cross-legged, sharpening his knife with that rhythmic shh sound. Men like him always want what they cannot have. They want the earth to bow to them. "My husband," Rhea began, her voice cracking. "He was a good man, Coda, but he was weak. He thought he could get rich quickly and give us a palace. He died of a burst heart pulling a wagon out of the mud in Nebraska. He left me with Jonah and Lila and nothing else but a plot of dirt nobody wanted." She looked down at Coda. "I swore on his grave, and on my sister's grave, that no one would touch the children, that I would be the wall between them and the world." Coda stopped sharpening the knife. He looked up at her. The firelight softened the harsh angles of his face. "You are a strong wall, Rhea," he said softly. "I am tired, Coda," she confessed, the whiskey loosening the knot in her chest. "I am so tired of being afraid every time a horse rides by. I think it is the end." Coda rose to his knees. He was close to her now, so close she could smell the sage on his skin and the leather of his vest. He reached out, his hand hovering for a moment before he gently covered her hand that rested on her knee. "You are not alone on the wall anymore," he said. The touch was electric. Rhea looked at his hand, dark and scarred, covering hers, pale and worn. It was a contrast that the world said was wrong, unnatural, but in the warmth of the cabin, it felt like the only right thing in the universe. She looked up into his eyes. The darkness there was not empty. It was deep, like the night sky, full of silent stars. "Coda," she breathed. He leaned in. The movement was slow, giving her 1,000 chances to pull away. She did not. She leaned forward, drawn by a gravity she could no longer resist. Their lips met. It was not the polished, practiced kiss of a romance novel. It was tentative, tasting of whiskey and desperation. Coda's lips were rough, but his touch was terrifyingly gentle, as if he were handling a wounded bird. Rhea let out a soft sound, a whimper of release, and her hand moved up to grip the front of his shirt. For a moment, the world outside the sheriff, the railroad, the poverty ceased to exist. There was only the fire, the wind, and the man who made her feel safe. Then, reality crashed back in. The image of the children alone in the shack, the danger she was putting them in by being here. Rhea pulled back, gasping. Her eyes were wide, dark with desire, but also with sudden panic. "I cannot," she stammered, pushing against his chest. If this happens, it complicates everything. You know what they will say." Coda did not try to hold her. He sat back, his chest heaving slightly. He respected her fear because he understood it better than anyone. "They will say what they say," Coda said, his voice rough. "But words do not bleed. Words can kill." "Coda," Rhea said, standing up unsteadily. "In this town, words can kill." She grabbed her shawl and fled the cabin, running out into the cool night air, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. Down in the valley, hidden in a clump of mesquite bushes near the trailhead, Deputy Pike shifted his weight. He was cold, and he was bored, but he had his orders. He watched the dark figure of Rhea Collins hurry down the path from the Indian's cabin. It was late, past 10 o'clock. Pike struck a match to light his cigarette, the flare illuminating his greasy grin. Well, he chuckled to himself. The sheriff was right. The widow has a nocturnal habit. He stood up, dusting off his trousers. Now I have the weapon. The next morning, the sky was a brilliant, mocking blue. Rhea was feeding the children a porridge made from the cornmeal Coda had bought. They were laughing, Jonah teasing Ben about a lizard he had caught. The sound of hooves silenced them. Rhea stood up, wiping her hands on her apron. She stepped out of the shack. Sheriff Granger was there, sitting high on his black horse. Behind him was Deputy Pike and a man in a suit Rhea did not recognize. Granger dismounted. He did not smile this time. He looked like an executioner. "Mrs. Collins," Granger said, pulling a sheaf of papers from his saddlebag. "Get off my land," Rhea said, her voice shaking but loud. "It is not your land," Granger said. Not anymore, but that is a matter for the civil courts. I'm here on a criminal matter. Rhea went cold. What are you talking about? Granger walked closer, slapping the papers against his palm. It has come to my attention that you are harboring 2 children, Benjamin and Rose, who are not your biological issue. You have no legal guardianship papers filed with the territory. They are my sister's children, Rhea cried. She died? I am their aunt. So you say, Granger drawled. But the law requires proof, and the law requires that a guardian be of moral character. He paused, letting the silence stretch. He looked at Pike, who snickered. A woman who spends her nights in the bed of a savage, Granger said, his voice dripping with venom, is not a fit mother. She is a woman of loose morals, a danger to the welfare of Christian children. Rhea felt like she had been punched in the stomach. You followed me. We protect the community, Granger said. I have a court order here. Rhea, I can take those 2 children right now. There is an orphanage in Cheyenne run by the church. They take in the unwanted. I hear they are always looking for strong backs for the farm work, and pretty little girls for domestic service. Rhea lunged at him. You will not touch them. You will have to step over my dead body. Jonah ran out of the shack, holding a stick as if it were a rifle. Leave my ma alone, Granger laughed. A harsh, barking sound. Put down the stick, boy, before I arrest you for assaulting an officer. He turned back to Rhea, his face hardening. Here is the deal. Rhea, you sign the quitclaim deed on this land. You hand it over to the railroad, and you come work for me. You do that, and I will forget I saw these papers. I will let you keep your little mongrel family together. And if I don't, Rhea whispered, then I come back tomorrow with a wagon. Granger said, I take the kids to Cheyenne, and I tell the judge exactly what you do up on that hill with Coda Blackhawk. I will paint a picture so vivid. They will not only take the kids, they will run you out of town on a rail. He tipped his hat. You have until noon tomorrow. Think about it. Your pride or your children. He mounted his horse and rode away, leaving Rhea standing in the dust, the papers fluttering in the wind like the wings of a dying bird. Coda Blackhawk was checking his traps on the north ridge when he felt it. A disturbance in the air. He climbed a rock outcropping and looked down at the valley. He saw the dust cloud of the sheriff's posse leaving Rhea's shack. He made his way down the mountain, not on the trail, but straight down the rock face, moving with a reckless speed. He found Rhea sitting on the ground outside the shack, her arms wrapped around her knees. The children were inside, silent. Rhea looked up. Her eyes were red, but dry. She looked hollowed out. He knows, she said, her voice dead. He knows about us, about last night. Coda stood over her, his hands clenching into fists. I will kill him. No, Rhea stood up, grabbing his arm. If you kill him, the army comes, they will hang you, and they will take the children anyway because I will be the woman who conspired with a murderer. He threatens the little ones. Coda growled. He forfeits his life. He is using the law. Coda, Rhea cried. He says I am unfit because I am with you. He says I am a whore for a redskin. The slur hung in the air, ugly and poisonous. Coda flinched as if struck. He pulled his arm away from her. He turned his back, looking out at the vast, indifferent landscape. The conflict raged inside him like a wildfire. He understood the white man's world. He knew their courts. He knew that his presence in Rhea's life was the poison Granger was using to kill her. If he stayed, if he fought for her, he proved Granger right in the eyes of the town. A white woman with an Indian warrior was a scandal that no judge would forgive. His very love, if that was what this burning in his chest was the weapon that would destroy her family. But if he left, if he packed his cabin and rode north, away from her, the accusations would lose their teeth. She could say he was gone. She could beg for mercy. I am the problem, Coda said quietly. No, Rhea said fiercely, coming around to face him. You are the only good thing in this. I am the weapon he uses against you, Coda said. He looked at her, and for the first time, There was fear in his eyes. Not fear of death, but fear of being the cause of her destruction. "I should go," he said. "If I am not here, he has no leverage." "If you go," Rhea said, grabbing his vest. "He wins. He takes the land. He takes me, and he breaks us. Do not you dare leave me, Coda Blackhawk. Do not you dare let him make you believe you are the sin here." Coda looked down at her hands gripping his buckskin. He covered them with his own. "I do not leave," he vowed, his voice a low rumble. "But we cannot fight him with guns alone. If he wants to use the law, then we must break his law." He looked toward the town, his eyes narrowing. "Tomorrow at noon," Coda said. "He comes for the children." "Yes," Rhea whispered. "Then tomorrow at noon," Coda said. "He finds a war he did not expect." The wind howled around the flimsy shack, but inside the circle of their joined hands, the air was still and heavy with the promise of violence. The trap was set. The stakes were the highest a person could gamble the lives of 4 innocent children, and the Fearest man in town was done hiding on his hill. The sky over Redstone Gulch did not just turn dark, it bruised. Great swollen clouds, the color of a fresh hematite, rolled in from the north, strangling the last light of the sunset. The air grew heavy, charged with a static electricity that made the hair on a man's arm stand up and horses stamp nervously in their stalls. It was the same kind of storm that had torn the roof off Coda Blackhawk's cabin. A violent, thrashing beast of wind and water that respected no boundary and feared no law. By 8 o'clock, the rain began. It did not start as a drizzle, but as a deluge. Sheets of water hammering the earth with the force of lead shot. The temperature plummeted. Inside the fragile shanty on the edge of the scrubland, Rhea Collins paced the dirt floor. The sound of the rain on the corrugated tin sheets and the canvas roof was deafening. A constant, roaring drum roll. Water was already leaking through the corners, turning the dust floor into slick mud. "Ma, sit down," Jonah said. He was sitting on a crate near the door, the rusted Navy Colt resting on his knees. He looked small in the flickering light of the kerosene lamp, but his face was set in a grim mask of determination that belonged to a man of 30. "He said noon," Rhea whispered, wringing her hands. "Granger said noon tomorrow." "He is a snake," Jonah said, echoing the words Coda had taught him. "Snakes do not keep appointments." Lila was in the corner, huddled under a moth-eaten blanket with Ben and Rose. The baby was sleeping fitfully, but Ben was awake, his eyes wide and terrified every time the thunder cracked like a whip over their heads. "Tell us a story, Lila," Ben whispered. "Hush," Lila said, stroking his hair. "Listen to the rain. It is washing the world clean." But the rain was not washing anything clean. It was providing cover. Outside, the mud churned under the hooves of 5 horses moving slowly through the deluge. Sheriff Eli Granger pulled his hat brim low against the driving rain. He was not alone. Beside him rode Deputy Pike, and behind them were 3 men hired from the cattle yards, hard men with no names and fewer morals, paid in whiskey and silver to do the things the law could not technically sanitize. Granger smiled into his scarf. Noon was for public spectacles. Midnight, under the cover of a storm, was for results. He wanted the children gone and Rhea broken before the town even woke up to drink its morning coffee. They reached the clearing. The shanty looked pathetic in the lightning flashes, a heap of trash clinging to the earth. "Kick it in," Granger ordered, his voice lost in the wind but his gesture clear. 2 of the hired men dismounted. They hit the blanket door together. The flimsy wood frame shattered, and the wet canvas tore away. Rhea screamed as the storm rushed into her home, followed by 3 soaking wet men smelling of horse sweat and violence. "Get out," Jonah yelled. He raised the heavy pistol with both hands, his knuckles white. Deputy Pike laughed, a wet, gurgling sound. He stepped forward, ignoring the weapon as if it were a toy. "Look at the puppy. Eli, he thinks he has teeth." "Fire, boy!" Rhea shrieked. Lunging forward, Jonah squeezed the trigger. The hammer fell with a dull, sickening click. The powder was wet, or the cap was dead. It did not matter. The gun was useless. Pike backhanded Jonah across the face. The blow was heavy and cruel. Jonah flew backward, hitting the wall and crumpling to the mud, the gun skittering away into the darkness. "Jonah!" Rhea screamed. She threw herself at Pike, her nails raking for his eyes. Pike grabbed her by her hair and threw her down hard. She landed in the mud near the stove, gasping for breath. Granger stepped into the shack, shaking the water from his oilskin coat. He looked like a giant in the small space, blocking out the only exit. He pulled a folded, damp piece of paper from his pocket. "I told you, Rhea!" Granger shouted over the thunder. "The law does not wait for your convenience. This is an order of seizure, for the property, and for the wards of the state." He pointed a gloved finger at the corner. "Grab the kids. Tie them if they bite." The 3 hired men moved toward the corner where Lila was screaming, shielding Rose with her own body. Ben was wailing, a high, thin sound that cut through the noise of the storm. "No!" Rhea scrambled to her knees. She grabbed the iron handle of a frying pan from the stove. "You touch them and I will kill you." Granger kicked the pan from her hand, sending it clattering against the wall. He grabbed her wrist, twisting it until she cried out, forcing her face down into the mud. "You have no rights here, trash!" Granger hissed into her ear. "You are a whore who lays with animals. I am doing these children a favor." One of the men grabbed Lila by the arm, dragging her up. She bit his hand, hard. He swore and raised a fist to strike her. Then, the lightning struck nearby, illuminating the doorway in a flash of blinding white light. Standing there was not a man. It was a nightmare. Coda Blackhawk stood in the ruined entrance. He was stripped to the waist, his skin slick with rain and oil. His black hair was plastered to his skull and shoulders. He wore no hat. The rain ran down the grooves of his muscles like rivers on a map. In his right hand, he held a long, curved knife. On his left, his Winchester. He did not look human. He looked like the spirit of the storm itself, summoned by the screams of the innocent. The man holding Lila froze, his fist in the air. "Let her go," Coda said. His voice was not loud, but it cut through the thunder like a blade. Granger spun around, releasing Rhea. He went for his gun, but his coat was heavy and wet, and his fingers were numb with cold. "You!" Granger shouted, trying to summon his authority. "This is official business. Blackhawk, step away, or I will have you hanged for interfering with a lawman." Coda stepped into the shack. The air seemed to get smaller, sucked out by his presence. "There is no law here tonight. Eli?" Coda said, "Only the rain." "Kill him," Granger shouted to his men. "Kill the savage!" The man who had been holding Lila dropped her and went for his holster. Coda moved. He did not fire the rifle. At this range, it was a club. He swung the stock of the Winchester in a brutal arc, catching the man under the chin. There was a sickening crack of bone, and the man went down like a sack of grain. The shack exploded into chaos. Pike fired his revolver. The bullet tore through the canvas wall, missing Coda by inches. Coda dropped low, rolling across the mud floor. He came up swinging the knife. He slashed Pike's leg, not deep enough to kill, but deep enough to sever the muscle. Pike screamed and collapsed, clutching his thigh. The other 2 hired men opened fire. The deafening boom of gunshots in the enclosed space was disorienting. Smoke filled the air, mixing with the smell of ozone and blood. Rhea did not stay on the floor. She saw a man aiming at Coda's back. She grabbed a heavy piece of stove wood and swung it with both hands. It connected with the man's kidneys. He grunted, arching his back in pain, his shot going wild into the roof. "Jonah!" Coda roared, ducking under a wild haymaker punch from the second hired hand. "The gun!" Jonah, shaking the dizziness from his head, saw Coda's Winchester lying in the mud where he had dropped it to use the knife. The boy scrambled on his hands and knees. He grabbed the rifle. It was heavy, too heavy for him to aim, but he shoved it across the slick floor. "Coda!" Jonah yelled. Coda kicked the hired man in the knee, shattering the joint, and dove for the rifle. He caught it, rolled onto his back, and jacked the lever. Click-clack. The sound was unmistakable. He fired from the floor. The bullet hit the shoulder of the man Rhea had struck, spinning him around and sending him crashing through the remains of the table. Silence fell, heavy and ringing. 3 men were down, groaning in the mud. Pike was whimpering in the corner. Only Sheriff Granger was left standing. He had backed up against the far wall, dragging Rhea with him. He had his arm around her throat, choking her, and the barrel of his Colt was pressed against her temple. "Stop!" Granger screamed, his eyes wide and white with panic. "Drop it! Indian, drop it or I paint the wall with her brains!" Coda froze. He was on one knee, the rifle raised, aimed squarely at Granger's chest. His chest was heaving, rain and sweat dripping from his nose. A thin line of blood ran down his arm where a bullet had grazed him, but he did not seem to feel it. "Let her go," Coda said. His voice was a low growl, vibrating with a rage that had been building for 100 years. "You put the gun down!" Granger shrieked, pressing the barrel harder into Rhea's skin. She gasped, clawing at his arm, her eyes locked on Coda. "He will kill her," Granger said, panting. "I swear it. I am the law. You cannot touch me. You are a coward hiding behind a woman." Coda said, "You talk of law. You bring guns to a house of children at night. That is not law. That is war." "It is my town," Granger yelled. "My rules. You are just a relic, Black Hawk, a ghost. You have no voice in a white man's court. I do not need a court to know a rabid dog when I see one." Coda said. He shifted his grip on the rifle. The distance was 15 feet. A difficult shot in the smoke and shadows. If he missed, Rhea died. If he shot Granger, the hammer of the sheriff's gun might fall on reflex. The standoff stretched, agonizing seconds ticking by. The only sound was the rain and Ben's soft sobbing. Suddenly, the sound of a bugle. No, a carriage horn cut through the storm outside. "Sheriff Granger," a voice boomed from the darkness. "Drop your weapon." Granger's eyes flickered to the doorway. "Who is there?" Doc Calder stepped into the light. He was holding a double-barreled shotgun, and he did not look drunk tonight. Beside him was Alma, the saloon owner, holding a lantern high, and behind them, flanked by 2 men from the town council, was a small, bespectacled man clutching a leather satchel to his chest. "It is over. Eli," Doc Calder said, stepping into the room, his shotgun leveled at the sheriff. "Let her go. You are making a mistake. Doc," Granger stammered, sweat mixing with the rain on his face. "This woman is a criminal. We have the papers. Eli," Alma said, her voice hard as granite. She pointed to the little man. "This is Mr. Sterling, the county clerk from Cheyenne. We sent it to him 3 days ago when you started making threats." "Mr. Sterling cleared his throat, looking terrified but standing his ground. I have the original deed here. Sheriff, signed by Mr. Collins and countersigned by the territorial governor. The land belongs to Rhea Collins, and the adoption papers for the children. They were filed in St. Louis 4 years ago. They are legal." Granger's face went pale. The legal shield he had been hiding behind had just evaporated. "You hid the copies," Doc Calder said, his voice full of disgust. "You filed them in the dead archive so you could steal the land for the railroad kickback. We found the correspondence in your office safe while you were out here playing soldier." "It is a lie," Granger shouted, but his grip on Rhea loosened slightly. "The whole town knows. Eli," Alma said. "The railroad representative is in my saloon right now. He was very interested to hear how you were planning to defraud his company by inflating the land price." Granger looked around the room. His hired men were broken. The town leaders were witnessing his crime. He was alone, but he still had the gun, and he still had the hate. He looked at Coda. The Indian was still kneeling, the rifle perfectly still. "I might go to jail," Granger snarled, a madness taking over his eyes. "But I will not let a savage win. I will not let you have her." He started to move the gun away from Rhea's head, aiming it toward Coda. Rhea saw it. She bit Granger's arm with every ounce of strength she had left. Granger howled. Flinching, Rhea dropped to the floor, scrambling away. For 1 second, Granger was exposed. He raised his gun toward Coda. Coda Blackhawk did not hesitate. The conflict in his soul roared. Every instinct, every memory of his slaughtered people, every scar on his body screamed at him to put a bullet through Eli Granger's heart, to end the threat, to take the vengeance that belonged to his blood. "Kill him," the warrior whispered. "Save them," the father whispered. If he killed Granger, he was a murderer. He would be hunted. He would have to leave Rhea and the children forever to keep them safe from his legacy. If he let him live. Coda pulled the trigger. Bang! The sound was singular and final. Sheriff Granger jerked violently backward, slamming against the wall. He dropped his gun, clutching his head, screaming. "I am dead, I am dead," Granger wailed, sliding down the wall, but he was not dead. The bullet had not struck his skull. It had struck the silver star pinned to his chest, shattering the badge and sending shards of metal into his shoulder, and then ricocheted up to crease the side of his head, taking off the top of his ear and his hat. He was alive, but he was marked, and he was broken. Coda lowered the rifle. Smoke curled lazily from the barrel. Doc Calder rushed forward, kicking Granger's gun away. The town council members moved in to restrain the sobbing, bleeding sheriff. Rhea crawled across the mud. She did not go to the children first. She went to Coda. She reached him as he slumped forward, the adrenaline leaving his body. She grabbed his face with her muddy hands. "You did not kill him?" she whispered, her voice trembling with awe. Coda looked at her. His eyes were tired, ancient. He looked at Granger, who was being dragged out into the rain in handcuffs by the men he had once commanded. "I missed," Coda grunted. Rhea shook her head, a tear cutting a clean track through the dirt on her cheek. "You never miss." Coda looked past her, to where Jonah was helping Lila stand up. The boy was looking at Coda not with fear, but with a worshipful gaze. "I am not him," Coda said quietly, looking at his own hands. "I do not sell another man's life to save my own." Mr. Sterling, the clerk, stepped forward nervously, looking at the carnage. "Sheriff Eli Granger is hereby under arrest," he announced to the room, his voice squeaking slightly, "for corruption, assault, and attempted murder." Doc Calder looked at Coda. That was a hell of a shot. Blackhawk, an inch to the left and he would be dead. An inch to the right and he would be untouched, Coda said. Standing up, he towered over the doctor. "I gave him a scar, so every time he looks in a mirror, he remembers the night he lost to a woman and a savage." The storm outside was beginning to break. The thunder rolled away to the east, leaving behind the steady, rhythmic sound of rain falling on the roof. But inside, the air was different. The fear that had ruled Rhea's life for years was gone, washed away in the mud and the blood. Coda holstered his knife. He walked over to Jonah. The boy flinched slightly, then stood tall. Coda reached out and put a hand on the boy's shoulder. "You held the line, warrior." Jonah's lip quivered, and then he threw his arms around Coda's waist, burying his face in the wet buckskin. Coda hesitated, his hands hovering in the air for a moment, before slowly, awkwardly, settling onto the boy's back. Rhea watched them, her heart swelling until she thought it might burst. The climax of the night was not the gunshot. It was this, the fearest man in town, holding a crying boy in a ruined shack, while the law finally, for the first time in history, stood on the side of the righteous. The dawn that broke over Redstone Gulch the morning after the storm was painfully bright. The sun climbed over the jagged eastern peaks, casting long, sharp shadows across the valley floor, illuminating the wreckage left behind by the night's violence. The air was scrubbed clean, smelling of wet sage, ozone, and the metallic tang of drying mud. At the edge of the scrubland, Rhea Collins' shanty stood like a broken tooth. The canvas roof hung in tatters, flapping listlessly in the morning breeze. The mud around the doorway was churned into a chaotic tapestry of hoofprints and boot marks. Spent brass casings from the Winchester and the Colt revolvers glinted in the red dirt like discarded gold. It was a scene of devastation, a small, ugly battlefield where a war for the soul of a family had been fought and, against all odds, won. But the shanty was empty, high on the ridge, inside the sturdy timber walls of the cabin that overlooked the town. The atmosphere was quiet. It was not the silence of emptiness, but the hushed, reverence-filled silence of recovery. Coda Blackhawk sat on the edge of his cot. He was stripped to the waist, his skin dark against the pale wool of the blanket. The bullet from Deputy Pike's gun had not dug deep, but it had carved a nasty, red furrow across his bicep before tearing through his shirt. It was throbbing with a dull, hot ache, a reminder that even legends bleed. Rhea sat beside him. She had washed the mud from her face and hands, though her hair was still wild, drying in waves around her shoulders. She held a basin of warm water and a strip of clean white cloth, part of her own petticoat she had torn up without a second thought. "Hold still," she murmured, dipping the cloth into the water. Coda flinched as the warm fabric touched the raw flesh. His muscles bunched under her hand, hard as ironwood. "It is a scratch," Coda grunted, staring straight ahead at the cold fireplace. "I have had worse briar patches." It is a bullet wound." "Coda," Rhea corrected him, her voice firm but gentle. "And if it festers, you will lose the arm. Then how will you chop wood?" She cleaned the wound with a meticulous, tender focus. Coda looked at her profile. He saw the exhaustion etched under her eyes, the bruise forming on her wrist where Granger had grabbed her. But he also saw a strength that terrified him. Last night, amidst the thunder and the gunfire, she had not cowered. She had fought. She had bitten a man to save him. He looked at her hands that were usually red and cracked from lye soap, now stained with his blood and the water. He felt a strange tightening in his chest that had nothing to do with the injury. "You should be with the children," Coda said. Rhea tied off the bandage, pulling the knot tight with her teeth before smoothing the ends. "The children are with Dr. Calder and Alma. They are eating pancakes and drinking milk with sugar in it. Jonah is probably telling the doctor how to hold a gun properly." She finally looked up, meeting his gaze. Her blue eyes were clear, stripping away his defenses one by one. "They are safe," she whispered. "For the first time in years, they are truly safe." Coda looked away, focusing on the dust motes dancing in the shaft of sunlight. "Granger is gone, but the town remains. Memories are long here." "Let them remember," Rhea said fiercely. She placed her hand on his uninjured shoulder, her palm warm against his cool skin. "Let them remember that when the law tried to destroy us, the man they called a savage was the only one who stood tall." Coda did not pull away, but he did not lean into her touch. He felt like a man standing on the edge of a cliff, the ground crumbling beneath his boots. He had fought the war. He had won the battle. But he did not know how to survive the peace. Down in the town, the mood had shifted like the wind. The story of the night's events had spread with the speed of a prairie fire. By mid-morning, everyone from the blacksmith to the banker knew that Sheriff Eli Granger had been dragged out of the mud in irons, weeping like a child, while Coda Blackhawk had spared his life at Alma's place. The saloon was closed for business, transformed into a makeshift nursery. Jonah, Lila, Ben, and Rose were sitting at the best table, the one usually reserved for high-stakes poker. They were clean, dressed in oversized but warm clothes that Alma had scrounged from the general store. Dr. Calder sat with them, looking tired but satisfied. He was nursing a cup of coffee, his shotgun leaning against the bar. "Did you see him?" Jonah asked, his mouth full of biscuit. "Did you see Coda? He moved like smoke. He took the gun right out of the bad man's hand." "I saw him, son," Dr. Calder said, smiling. "He is a formidable man." "He is my pa now," Rose announced, banging her spoon on the table. The room went quiet. A few of the saloon girls, who were helping clean up, exchanged glances. Mr. Sterling, the county clerk, cleared his throat. He was sitting at a small desk in the corner, organizing a stack of papers. "Legally speaking," Mr. Sterling said, adjusting his spectacles. "The matter of guardianship is settled. The papers from St. Louis are authentic. Rhea Collins is the legal guardian. And as for the land," he tapped a thick document, "the deed is ironclad. The railroad cannot touch it without her consent. And Sheriff Granger's attempt to invalidate it was, well, it was criminal fraud." Alma wiped the bar with a rag. "So, the widow keeps the land, and the kids." "She does," Sterling said. "And with Granger facing a territorial judge, I dare say no one in Redstone Gulch will be eager to harass her again." Outside on the boardwalk, the citizens of Redstone Gulch walked with a new hesitation. They looked up at the ridge where the cabin stood. For years, they had looked up there with fear, seeing a threat. Now, they looked up with a confusing mixture of shame and respect. They had stood by while a corrupt man terrorized a woman. It took the outsider, the man they feared, to show them what honor looked like. "I reckon," the blacksmith said to the grocer, spitting tobacco juice into the dust, "that we might have had the wrong idea about the Indian." "Don't call him that," the grocer muttered, looking at his boots. "His name is Blackhawk." Back in the cabin, the air had grown heavy. Rhea had finished tending to Coda and had gone outside to wash the bloody rags. When she returned, the cabin had changed. It was subtle at first. The few personal items Coda owned: his pipe, a carved wooden figure of a horse. His spare moccasins were no longer on the shelves. She looked at the bed. The buffalo robe was folded into a tight square. She looked at the corner. His saddlebags were packed, bulging with supplies. His Winchester was in its leather scabbard, leaning against the doorframe. Rhea stopped in the middle of the room, the basin of water slipping from her hands to crash onto the floor. Water soaked into the wood she had scrubbed so clean just a week ago. "What are you doing?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Coda was standing by the hearth, checking the edge of his knife. He slid it into the sheath at his belt and turned to face her. He had put his shirt back on, buttoning it to the chin, covering the bandage and the tattoo. He looked like he had the first day she met him closed off, armored, distant. "The storm is over," Coda said. His voice was flat, devoid of the warmth she had heard the night before. "The sheriff is gone. You have your land. The clerk says you are safe." "So you are leaving?" Rhea asked, the shock turning quickly to a hot, rising anger. "Just like that, you pack your bag and ride into the sunset." "I am a warrior, Rhea," Coda said. "I am not a farmer. I am not a town man. I bring violence." "You brought peace," Rhea shouted, stepping over the spilled water. "You stopped the violence." "Last night," Coda said. "I almost put a bullet in a man's head while he held you. Next time, maybe I will not miss it. Next time, maybe the army comes looking for the Indian who shot a sheriff. Do you want Jonah to see that? Do you want Rose to see me hanging from a rope?" He walked past her, picking up his saddlebags. "I am poisoned to a quiet life. You have a chance now. Build your house. Raise the children. Find a man who can walk down the street without hands moving to holsters." Rhea turned and grabbed his arm. She dug her fingers into the buckskin, anchoring him. "You coward!" she hissed. Coda froze. He looked down at her, his eyes flashing dangerous fire. "I am many things. Woman. But I am not a coward." "Yes, you are," Rhea said, tears welling in her eyes, hot and angry. "You stood in front of 4 guns last night and didn't blink. But now that the fighting is done, now that the hard part is over and the living begins, you are running away. You are terrified." "I will protect you," Coda growled. "From what?" Rhea demanded. "From happiness, from being loved." She stepped closer, forcing him to look at her. She was small against his bulk, but she felt 10 feet tall in her fury. "You think you are just a killer," she said, her voice shaking. "You think because you survived a war, that is all you are good for. But I saw you fix the roof so we would be dry. I saw you bring meat so Ben would not starve. I saw you teach Jonah how to hold a gun so he wouldn't hurt himself." She reached up, placing her hand flat over his heart. She could feel it beating heavy, steady, powerful. "You held a crying boy in the mud last night. "Coda," she whispered. "You let Rose touch your feather. That is not a warrior. That is a father." The word hung in the air between them, heavier than any stone. "Father." Coda stared at her. His breath hitched in his chest. He had been called scout, tracker, killer, savage, and ghost. But no one had ever called him father. The word cracked the armor he had spent 10 years welding around his soul. It reached in and touched the boy he had been before the wars, the man he had hoped to be before the world broke. He looked at Rhea. He saw the fierce determination in her blue eyes, the love that she was offering him with open hands, a love that asked for nothing but his presence. "I am broken," Coda whispered, his voice breaking. "I have too many ghosts." "Then let us help you carry them," Rhea said. She moved her hand from his chest to his neck, her fingers tangling in the long, black hair at his nape. She pulled him down. "Stay," she breathed against his lips. "Just stay." The dam broke. Coda dropped the saddlebags. They hit the floor with a heavy thud. He wrapped his arms around her, pulling her into him with a desperation that bordered on pain. He buried his face in the crook of her neck, inhaling the scent of her soap, and rain, and life. Then he kissed her. It was not like the kiss in the firelight, tentative and afraid. This was a claim. It was deep, searing, and absolute. His mouth moved over hers with a hunger that had been denied for a lifetime. Rhea met him with equal force, her hands gripping his shoulders, pulling him closer, trying to merge her body with his. They stood in the center of the cabin, amidst the spilled water and the dust, clinging to each other as if the world outside were ending. The kiss went on, a silent conversation of promises made and fears surrendered. It was the end of the solitude. It was the end of the fearest man in town, and the beginning of Coda. When they finally broke apart, breathless and trembling, Coda rested his forehead against hers. His eyes were closed. "They will not accept it," he murmured. "The town, the world, they will look at us and see a sin." Rhea reached up and traced the line of his jaw with her thumb. "Let them look. Let them stare until they go blind." Coda opened his eyes. He looked over Rhea's head, out the window toward the horizon. The vast, open expanse of the west stretched out before him, miles of prairie, mountains, and sky. It was the land he had fought for, the land that had bled him dry. It was a hard country, unforgiving of weakness and intolerant of difference. He saw the challenges waiting, the whispers in the general store, the men who would challenge him just to see if the legend was true, the struggle to raise 4 white children as an Indian man in a territory that wanted him dead. "It will be a war," Coda said softly, "a different kind of war. Every day." Rhea followed his gaze. She took his hand, intertwining her fingers with his scarred ones. She squeezed tight. "You have fought the whole world for 10 years. Coda," she said, "and you won. You do not need to fight the whole West anymore." She turned his face back to hers. "You just need us. You just need this cabin, and that patch of land, and those 4 kids who think you hung the moon." Coda looked at her. He looked at the woman who had walked up a mountain to clean his floor and ended up cleaning his soul. Slowly, a smile touched his lips. It was small, rusty from disuse, but it was real. 4 kids, he muttered, shaking his head. "And one of them thinks he is a gunslinger." Rhea laughed, a sound like a bell in the quiet room. "He needs a good teacher." Coda sighed, a long exhalation that seemed to expel the last of the winter from his bones. He looked at his saddlebags on the floor. Then he looked at the bed, where the buffalo robe lay folded. "I will unpack," he said. Rhea smiled, tears shining in her eyes again. "Good, because the roof still leaks a little on the south side, and I am not climbing up there." Coda pulled her into his arms again, holding her gently, reverently. The fear was gone. The anger was gone. There was only the quiet hum of the mountains, and the beating of 2 hearts that had found their rhythm in the chaos. "I will fix the roof," Coda promised. "I will fix everything." The falling action ended not with a bang, but with the soft sound of leather saddlebags being kicked into a corner. and the silence of the cabin filling up with the warmth of a future that had finally arrived. 3 months had passed since the storm that washed the corruption out of Redstone Gulch, and the season had turned. The blistering heat of the late summer had surrendered to the crisp, golden chill of autumn. The cottonwood trees lining the creek bottom had turned a brilliant yellow, trembling like coins against the azure sky. The wind that swept down from the high peaks carried the scent of coming snow. Redstone Gulch itself seemed to have exhaled a breath it had been holding for years. The tension that used to hang over the streets like smoke had dissipated. The saloon doors still swung, the miners still drank, and the dust still coated everything in a fine red powder. But the malice was gone. Sheriff Eli Granger was gone. He was currently sitting in a cold iron cell in the county seat, 3 days' ride to the east, awaiting a circuit judge who was known for his lack of humor regarding land fraud and the threatening of children. The story of Granger's fall had become a favorite tale in the territory, growing taller with every telling. They said he cried when they took his badge. They said the mark on his ear, where Coda's bullet had grazed him, turned black as coal. In his place sat a new man, Sheriff Miller. He was a thick-set man with a mustache that looked like a push broom and a temperament that was aggressively boring. He did not take bribes from the cattle barons. He did not make deals with the railroad. He mostly drank coffee, walked the boardwalks checking door handles, and tipped his hat to ladies. He was exactly what the town needed, a lawman who made the law dull. But the biggest change was not in the town square. It was on the edge of the scrubland, where a tattered shanty had once stood against the wind. The shanty was gone. In its place stood a house. It was not a mansion, but to the people of Redstone Gulch, it might as well have been a castle. It was built of sturdy pine logs, hauled down from the ridge by Coda's roan mare. The logs were notched and fitted with the precision of a master craftsman, a technique Coda had learned from his people to keep the winter wind at bay. But the roof was pitched high and shingled with cedar, and the windows were made of real glass ordered from St. Louis, a touch of the white man's world that Rhea had insisted upon. It was a hybrid structure, a physical manifestation of the two worlds that had collided and fused within its walls. It smelled of fresh sap and beeswax. A stone chimney, broad and solid, anchored the house to the earth, promising warmth against the blizzards that were sure to come. Coda Blackhawk was in the yard, splitting firewood. The rhythmic cracked thump of the axe was a steady heartbeat in the cool afternoon. He wore a heavy flannel shirt now, tucked into his buckskins. His hair was still long, the eagle feather still tied near his ear, but the tension that used to coil in his shoulders like a spring was gone. He was moving. For weeks, he had been bringing items down from the cabin on the hill. It was a slow process, a shedding of skin. He brought his tools, he brought his furs. He brought the few books he had saved from the mission school. But he did not empty the cabin completely. He left the cot. He left the iron stove. He left a stash of dry wood. "You are keeping it?" Rhea had asked him one morning as he unloaded a crate of traps. "A warrior needs high ground." Coda had answered simply, "Sometimes the noise of the valley is too much. Sometimes I need to remember who I was before I became who I am." Rhea understood. She did not ask him to board it up. She knew that to tame a wild thing completely was to kill its spirit. So the cabin remained on the ridge, a silent sentinel, a place for Coda to retreat when the weight of domesticity became too heavy, or when the ghosts of his past came knocking and needed to be answered in the old tongue. The children had thrived in the new soil of their life. Jonah sat on the porch railing, a book balanced on his knees. It was a primer on history, loaned to him by Dr. Calder. The doctor had taken a shine to the boy, seeing a sharp mind behind the wary eyes. Twice a week, Jonah went to the doctor's office to learn reading and ciphering. But resting next to Jonah on the railing was a rifle. It was a .22 caliber, small but deadly accurate. A gift from Coda. "Read 1 page," Coda had told him. "Then clean the barrel. The mind must be sharp, but the hand must be ready. A man who can only read is a victim. A man who can only shoot is a fool. Be neither." Jonah turned the page. mouthing the words, his hand unconsciously resting on the stock of the rifle. He was learning to be both. In the town, Lila was becoming a fixture at Alma's place. This had caused a scandal at first a 10-year-old girl in a saloon. But Alma was a force of nature. She kept Lila in the back office during the rowdy hours, teaching her how to balance the ledger, how to count inventory, and how to spot a cheat at 20 paces. "The world is hard on women, little bird," Alma told her as they counted stacks of silver dollars. "You need to know the value of a coin and the value of a secret. With those two things, you can rule a town." Lila was safe. The patrons knew that to look sideways at the girl was to invite the wrath of Alma, the doctor, and the silent shadow on the edge of town who carried a Winchester. Ben, the dreamer, had found his heaven. He was in the corral Coda had built behind the house. He was brushing the roan mare, standing on an overturned crate to reach her withers. The horse, usually skittish with strangers, stood perfectly still for the boy, lowering her head so he could comb her mane. Coda had promised him a foal in the spring. Ben spoke to the horse in whispers, telling her stories about clouds and dragons. And for the first time in his life, he did not jump at shadows. And then there was Rose. Rose was the battering ram that broke down the last walls of Redstone Gulch's prejudice. Later that afternoon, Coda walked into town to buy nails from the general store. He did not sneak down the alleys anymore. He walked down the center of Main Street, perched high on his shoulders, her small hands gripping his hair, was Rose. She was laughing, a bright, infectious sound that bounced off the storefronts. She wore a new coat Rhea had sewn, bright red, and tiny boots. "Faster! Pa!" she squealed, kicking her heels against Coda's chest. "Run like a horse." Coda did not run, but he quickened his stride, a small, rare smile playing on his lips. They passed the barber shop. 2 miners were sitting out front. They stopped talking as the pair approached. They looked at the massive Indian warrior, the Fearest man in town, playing mount to a tiny white girl. One of the miners spat tobacco juice and muttered something under his breath about nature's mistake. Coda stopped. He turned slowly to face the men. He did not reach for his knife. He simply looked at them with those obsidian eyes that had seen everything. "Say it again," Coda said. His voice was low, polite, and terrifying. The miner swallowed hard. He looked at Coda. Then he looked at Rose, who was staring down at him with innocent curiosity. "Just said, 'Looks like rain,'" the miner stammered, tipping his hat nervously. "Good day to you, Black Hawk." "Good day," Coda said. He adjusted Rose on his shoulders and kept walking. The town still whispered. They would always whisper. There were those who called them a mongrel family, who predicted disaster, who said that blood would eventually call to blood, but they whispered it behind closed doors, out in the open, the sight of Coda's devotion, and the undeniable fact that he had saved 4 white children from a corrupt white sheriff, commanded a grudging, silent respect. He had bought their safety not with gold, but with character. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, painting the sky in violent shades of violet and orange, a sound cut through the air. "Woo!" It was a high, mournful wail, distant but distinct. Coda and Rhea stood on the porch of their new home. Rhea wiped her hands on her apron, stepping out to stand beside him. "The train," she said softly. They looked south, miles away, across the valley floor. A plume of black smoke rose into the darkening sky. The iron rails had finally reached the pass. The first supply train was chugging toward the depot that was being built 5 miles east. The railroad had come. The isolation of Redstone Gulch was over. With the train would come more people, more laws, more money, and more problems. The civilized world was encroaching on the wild, shrinking the spaces where a man could live by his own code. Coda watched the smoke. He felt a twinge of the old instinct, the urge to fight the intruder, to push back against the metal beast that ate the land. "It brings a new world," Coda said. "The Old West is dying. Rhea, the days of the open range are numbered." Rhea reached out and took his hand. Her fingers were interlocked with his, her palm calloused but warm. "Let it die," she said. Or let it change. We are not living in the open range anymore. Coda, we are living here. She gestured to the house, to the light spilling from the windows where Jonah was reading to Ben, and where Lila was helping Rose stack wooden blocks. We built a fortress, Rhea said. Not of stone, but of this. Let the train come. Let the laws come. They cannot touch what is inside these walls. Coda looked down at her. The wind blew a strand of hair across her face. He reached out and tucked it behind her ear, his hand lingering on her cheek. A fortress of love, he murmured, testing the words. They felt strange on his tongue, but good. It is a strong defense. Come inside, Rhea whispered. The air is getting cold. Inside, the house was warm. The fire in the stone hearth crackled, casting a golden glow over the room. The children had been put to bed in the loft, their breathing a soft rhythm in the rafters. The main room was cozy. A rug of braided rags lay before the fire. The table was scrubbed clean. It smelled of stew and baking bread. Rhea sat on the edge of the large feather bed that occupied the corner of the room, partitioned off by a hanging quilt for privacy. She was brushing her hair, the long strokes mesmerizing in the firelight. She wore a thin white nightgown, and in the soft light, the curve of her belly was just visible, a gentle swell that had not been there 3 months ago. Coda secured the door, dropping the heavy wooden bar into place. He turned and saw her. He saw the curve. He walked over to her, moving quietly. He knelt on the floor between her knees. He did not speak. He reached out with a trembling hand and placed it on her stomach. Rhea covered his hand with hers, pressing it closer. He is strong, Rhea whispered. He kicked today when I was churning butter. Coda's eyes, usually so guarded, filled with sudden tears. He stared at his hand on her white gown. A child, Coda whispered. My child? He looked up at her, and the fear that he had buried deep inside finally surfaced. What will he be, Rhea? Coda asked, his voice rough with emotion. The world. They will ask, is he white? Is he Lakota? Will he belong to the town? Or to the tribe that no longer exists? He looked at her with desperate intensity. They will tear him in two. They will ask him to choose a side. Rhea leaned forward. She framed his face with her hands, forcing him to look at her. Her blue eyes were fierce, burning with the same strength that had held off a sheriff and raised 4 orphans in a shack. Let them ask, Rhea said firmly, and he will tell them the truth. What truth? Coda asked. That he belongs to the place where your hand meets my hand, Rhea said. He does not belong to the white man's law or the red man's war. He belongs to us. He belongs to the love that saved us both. She smiled, a soft, secret smile. And besides, if he has your stubbornness and my temper, the world will be too scared to ask him anything at all. Coda let out a breath that was half laugh, half sob. He leaned his forehead against her stomach, closing his eyes. He could feel the life there, a tiny flutter against his palm. It was a future he had never dared to dream of. He will be a bridge, Coda whispered to the unborn child. He will be the new West. Outside, the night settled over the high plains. The wind whispered through the sagebrush, carrying the secrets of the land. Once, this wind had carried the sound of war cries. Then, it had carried the lonely silence of a man who lived on a hill, waiting to die. But tonight, the wind carried something else. It carried the sound of a horse nickering in a corral. It carried the smell of wood smoke from a happy home. It carried the faint, rhythmic breathing of a family sleeping safe behind a locked door. Coda Blackhawk was still the toughest man in the territory. He could still track a spider across a rock face. He could still put a bullet through a coin at 50 paces. But the title, the Fearest Man in Town, no longer fits. Fear had packed its bags and left Redstone Gulch. It had been driven out by a washerwoman with a spine of steel and 4 children who refused to see a monster where there was only a man. Loneliness. The only enemy Coda had never been able to defeat, had fled into the darkness, chased away by the light of a kerosene lamp in a log cabin on the edge of the woods. Coda stood up and blew out the lamp. He climbed into the bed beside Rhea, pulling the quilt up over them. He wrapped his arm around her, his hand resting protectively on the life growing inside her. The warrior closed his eyes. The gun was near, but tonight he did not reach for it. Tonight, for the first time in 100 years, the West felt less like a battlefield and more like home. Closing well now, folks. That brings us to the end of Coda and Ria's trail. It's been a long ride from that dusty cabin on the hill to this warm firelight. Hasn't it? I hope this story warmed your bones a little and reminded you that even in the wildest lands, love is the only law that truly matters. I want to thank you kindly for sitting by the fire with me and listening to this tale. It means a lot to an old storyteller. Now, I'm mighty curious. Where are you folks listening from tonight? Are you in a big city with lights bright as stars? Or out in the quiet country? Drop a comment down below and let's swap some stories. And if you want to hear more yarns about gunfighters, redemption, and romance under the western sky, please go ahead and subscribe to my channel, Wild West Tales. Give this video a like if it touched your heart. And if you're feeling generous, hit that hype button to help this story ride the wind and reach more ears. Until next time, keep your powder dry and your heart open.